Good evening, and welcome to School of Visual Arts. My name is Eric Ingram. I'm an art librarian here at SVA with a focus on comics and sequential art, and I'm also tonight's organizer. Along with tonight's sponsors, the student organization Cartoon Allies and the SVA Library, it is my pleasure to welcome you to 100 Years of Genius, the life and legacy of Will Eisner. Thank you for coming, you guys. Tonight we honor a pioneer in the field of comics and a much-loved, longtime SVA instructor, Mr. Will Eisner. I see some SVA alumni in the audience, some former students of Mr. Eisner's. I'm so happy to see that. Students, these are people that you should say hello to. They have knowledge to impart, and they have amazing stories to tell. I've heard some of those stories. Tonight's panel is a part of Will Eisner Week, which is a series of events that take place all over the world, celebrating Mr. Eisner's life and legacy. And this year we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth. Will Eisner is a native New Yorker. He was born in Brooklyn on March 6, 1917, the son of Jewish immigrants. He was a product of New York public school system, including the legendary DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. No, nothing for the Bronx? Okay. Where one of his classmates and friends was Bob Kane, the creator of Batman. At age 19, Mr. Eisner started working in comics. 1 year later, he co-founded the Eisner and Iger studio. There he created such early comic characters as Dollman, Black Hawk, and Lady Luck. At the studio, Eisner employed Lou Fine, Mort Meskin, Bob Kane. See, students, when I tell you make friends with your fellow students, they can get you jobs. He also employed Jack Kurtzberg. You might know him better as Jack Kirby. At age 22, displaying the tenacity that would mark the rest of his career, he sold his share in the profitable studio to work on his creation, the newspaper insert comic book, The Spirit. It was here, through his innovative storytelling, experimental layouts, bold art, and beautiful splash pages, that he helped create the tropes or architecture that would define the comics medium. He pioneered another comics form during World War II, creating educational comics for the US Army. After The Spirit ended, he continued to produce these educational comics with his company American Visuals. He did this till 1971. Most notably, in 1968, he created a pamphlet distributed to troops during the Vietnam War on the proper handling of the M16 rifle. The rifle was notorious for jamming. Years later, veterans would come up to him at comic conventions to shake his hand, thanking him, saying his pamphlet had saved their life. Mr. Eisner was one of the first to take comics seriously as an artistic and literary form. This thinking, combined with his exposure to underground comics, led him to recreate himself in comics in the mid-70s. It was during this time that he started teaching here at SVA. He created 3 classic instruction books based on his classes here. It was in these books that he coined the phrase sequential art. His personal and professional reinvention culminated in 1978 with the publication of his book, A Contract with God, one of the first literary graphic novels. The book is informed by his early experiences growing up in New York's tenements. These experiences would go on to become the inspiration for much of his later work. He went on to create over a dozen more original graphic novels. Appropriately, comics' most prestigious awards are named the Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards. Thought of as the Oscars of comics, they are given out every year at the San Diego Comic-Con. Mr. Eisner's work and vision for what is possible with the medium has and continues to inspire, challenge, and delight new generations. Happy 100th birthday, Mr. Eisner. Students and alumni, you know what I'm going to say. We have all of Eisner's entire life works in the library. We have every publication about Mr. Eisner in the library. Please come check it out. And for everyone else that's not a student or alumni, check out New York Public Library. I checked their catalog today. They also have all of the Eisner books. Please support your local library. One of the students that inspired tonight's event would like to say a few words. Here is sophomore cartooning and illustration student and Cartoon Allies officer, Amanda Erskine.
Thank you, Eric. As a student and aspiring storyteller who has benefited from the intellectual freedom Will Eisner and Frank Miller have given the comic book industry, I am thankful to them for daring to break out of the formula a successful comic used to have, to diverge from writing the Marvel way and giving my generation of artists proof that you can have your own thoughts, your own art styles, and your own voice and succeed at this career. I wouldn't be here now if I didn't think that I had an honest shot at one day drawing professional comics that I actually like, that don't feel factory made, that have pieces of myself actually invested in it. Frank Miller has proven that you can be yourself on a page, and it works. And Will Eisner, with all of his advocacy over the years, has invented the idea. After all, Will Eisner came to SVA with these ideas for a grand future of cartooning and left generations before me inspired by his teaching. And now, even a full generation later, people he touched as a teacher have shaped this industry and have shaped me as someone who has grown up loving comics. I stand here as a member of SVA's 2019 graduating class, acknowledging what Will Eisner has left behind so many years ago, and what Frank Miller has carried on in making comics that give my generation an opportunity to pursue our own stories, much like these legendary artists that have come before us and continue to make the world take us seriously. Will Eisner is proof that where there is a will, there is a way, and Frank Miller today, with all that he has done and continues to do, teaches us with his distinctive style of work that you can be a successful cartoonist without sacrificing your individuality to fit a mold. Today, we SVA cartoonists all have the opportunity to hear what it was like to know the man who changed our industry, spoken by a man who has lived through and done incredible things in this industry, Mr. Frank Miller.
Technical difficulties. Klaus Janssen's impact as an inker is undeniable. Known for his bold, thick brushstroke, lots of kinetic energy, and use of heavy blacks to create a dark Noirish mood. Thus, one of the few name inkers whose work alone can be a selling point. His work has graced such classic books as The Defenders, Punisher, Spider-Man, Superman, his classic 7-year run on Daredevil, and of course, Batman, Dark Knight books. He is also celebrated for his pencil work, most notably on Batman Gothic. Since the 1990s, he has taught sequential storytelling here at SVA and has written both the DC Comics Guide to Penciling Comics and DC Comics Guide to Inking Comics. Frank Miller first burst onto the comic scene with his groundbreaking run on Daredevil. His mix of crime novels, film noir, Catholic imagery, and stunning art gave the character a level of realism new to superheroes. and was a turning point for comics as status quo. He had the audacity to make New York City, Hell's Kitchen, as much a subject of the book as the title character. He created the first female anti-hero, Elektra, and added martial arts elements to Daredevil's fighting skills. His ideas can be seen all over the hit Netflix Daredevil show. In 1985, he created the hugely influential Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. With this book, he merged great art and superhero storytelling with highly politicized and controversial elements, successfully erasing any lingering campiness of the character. His dark, gritty seriousness and deconstruction of the superhero mythos, wholly original to this book, has become the universal language of comics today. His revision proved so strong that it became his version became the definitive version of Batman and can be seen as recently in the movie Superman vs. Batman. He is also known for his original graphic novels. Ronin, that book stands out for its original mix of Japanese manga and French comics. He's also known for his creator-owned graphic novels, Hard Boiled, the Martha Washington trilogy, Sin City, and 300. That's all right, you can clap. These last two were turned into blockbuster movies. He co-directed Sin City and its sequel and produced 300. He was the first to successfully maneuver between comics writer, comics artist, screenwriter, film director, and producer. And today his career stands as a template for anyone wishing to work in the industry today. It is my pleasure and the entire SVA community's pleasure to welcome to the stage Mr. Klaus Janson and Mr. Frank Miller.
Eric, we're going to do a Q&A.
Yes, okay. Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
All right, buddy.
Yeah, what?
What do you want to talk about? Listen, I thought that we might start with Frank. When did you first notice or become aware of Will Eisner?
Yeah, it was. I was a kid in growing up in Vermont, and I would make it my routine to. When I was very, very young, I knew I wanted to write and draw comic books, and I was also a complete nut for reading them. And I would get on my bicycle and drive from the nearest. I drive to the nearest town, which was the capital of Vermont, and then over to its sister town.
This was Burlington, was it not?
No, it was the town was they both have French names, which I will mangle. The New England pronunciation was Montpelier and Barry.
Sure.
And I would bicycle to both towns in order to buy all the local comic books, because the distribution back then was nothing like it is today. The distribution was very, very spotty. So I had to bicycle to both towns to buy all the comic books. Well, along the way, there was one of the stores had this very strange comic book, which was much bigger than the rest and in black and white of all things, called The Spirit. And I opened it up and fell madly in love with it and wondered who this new guy was, because he was obviously the best guy around. And how he had exploded on the scene was, people usually take a while to prove they're good. This guy obviously was good instantly. I didn't know until I got home and read the comics and read the copyright notices that they were dated in the 1940s. It was Will Eisner's Spirit.
And this was, I'm guessing, like the mid-'70s, right?
Yeah.
The first time that I saw Eisner's work, it was a very similar story in the sense that it was just shocking to me how different it was and how different it looked from what was happening in mainstream comics at the time. Did you have a similar reaction to it?
Yeah, it was to me it was startling on every level. First visually, the artwork was just beautiful and bold, and it didn't obey any of the conventions that had become so cemented in American comics. The other thing is it did everything in black and white without needing any color. I had no idea they'd originally be published in color. That they never needed it. So I was struck by that. But beyond that was the sheer drama in it, and the adult content. By that I don't mean anything pornographic or anything seedy or anything like that. I meant the fact that it actually appealed to adult emotions. There were romances that were actually between men and women, that were not just juvenile fantasies. People actually wore clothing that hung from their shoulders and dresses that billowed in the wind. Everything wasn't made out of spandex. I remember in particular one story which was a two-part story that was 2 8-page increments, which was the story of the spirit and the first love of his life, Sans Serif. The very first thing I did when I became a professional writer doing Daredevil was to steal that story cold and use it as the origin of Elektra.
You know, one of the things that, and check me on this, Frank, but one of the things that so impresses me about Will Eisner's work, and did even at that time, even though I didn't know that this was a thing that he was doing, was his ability to write and draw in a way that was very cohesive.
Yeah.
As opposed to the rest of the stuff that was coming out of Marvel or DC at that time. Do you agree with that? It seemed to be, and in a lot of ways, I think that you've carried that forward in terms of your own work, writing and drawing your own work.
Well, Will encouraged me a great deal when I told him I wanted to, when I was starting to write my own work. He said his own theory about it was that the writer and artist should work as closely together as possible. In fact, they should inhabit the same body. So he always saw the two as being one, one element, and that and he pointed out to me that the division of labor had a lot to do with the economics of producing comics. That the splitting up of the duties of making a comic book into so many hands had an awful lot to do with producing them as swiftly as possible. But a side effect of that also was that it made it very easy for the publishers not only to control but to absolutely own every single thing about the comic book. And particularly in the 1980s, as more of us started to write and draw our material, we became more and more identified with material, and that stranglehold loosened. And I think it had a lot to do with the simple fact that a lot of us are now much more able to own the work we do.
Do you think that period of time, when creators started to write and draw their own material, that was the beginning of the kind of idealization or sort of when artists became superstars? Because we were always very much cogs in a wheel, for a very long time.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, something happened, where artists and writers became, I guess, celebrities.
Oh, we got to play for a while there. We were able to go to all these shows around the country and play rock star. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It was the rock star phenomenon.
It was a real change in the tone of things. And that, like anything else, that brought good things and it brought bad things, because any attention like that can turn some people into real jerks. But it did bring opportunities, and
Do you want to mention any names?
Jerks? No. Do you?
No, 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 not yet. It's
Maybe a little later.
no, it's still early. Yeah. So you obviously you discovered Eisner in the 70s when you were a teenager.
Yeah.
When did you actually meet him for the first time?
I'm trying to remember the exact year, and I can't. But I do. It must have been in the mid '80s. No, the early '80s, because I was transitioning from working with you on Daredevil to doing my Ronin series.
Right.
And I remembered because I showed him my work, and he proceeded to rip it to absolute shreds. He was very good at that.
What do you remember? What you showed him, Frank?
The very first thing I showed him was one of our Daredevils, and he. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but he showed me things I did that were particularly set him off, set his teeth on edge. Things where I would have, for instance, two people like us talking. You would say one thing, I would say the next, and then you would say something else, and it would all happen in one panel. And he said, you crossed over. You can't do that. There can't be more than one exchange per panel because a panel is a single element in time. That last phrase, a panel is a single element in time, sounds obvious as soon as I say it. And it sounded obvious as soon as he said it, but nobody had ever said it to me before. And from then on, I started realizing that's why the borders were around the panel. And it wasn't like a film on celluloid. It wasn't like a frame on celluloid. It was where it flickers by continuously. Mm-hmm. It was an element that stops you cold. Then there's a white gutter, and you move on to the next image. And so there cannot be an exchange back and forth across a panel because it is an instant. And time only exists across panels in sequence.
So help me out with this. Does that mean that Will thought that there should only be one balloon or one person speaking? One exchange.
You can say one thing, then I say one thing,
right.
Then it's a new panel.
Right, okay. So there's no rejoinder in a sense.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I can see the merit in that.
I can see it too. We argued it endlessly. I'd still argue it with him if you were around because I believe there are exceptions.
Do you remember the situation when you met? I mean, what was it, in his studio, or was it a party, or?
No, it was at SVA.
Was that SVA?
I mean, that was not, no, we first met at a party, and we got talking. And on the virtue of that conversation, the argument we had, he invited me to come. And so that we could argue in public, and he could destroy me in public, which he did.
Oh, so you continued the argument in class, in his class.
Yes. Just so he could bring me up in front of the class and slap me down good.
For all the world to witness,
yes.
Apparently. Was there something about besides the exchange in one panel that he focused on with you, or?
Oh no, we talked about all manner of things.
Right.
And he mainly though he wanted me there because I was attracting a younger audience than he had, and he wanted to get questions that he wouldn't have gotten himself, and then he wanted us both to answer them, and so, well, what it did was it brought the conversation more into questions about adventure and questions that about things that were much more extraordinary. And the idea is he wanted to shake up his own class. And as always, he wanted to challenge himself.
I never had the chance to meet him or sit in one of his classes.
You really missed out.
Pardon?
You really missed out.
I would imagine, yeah. I think that he must have been quite brilliant in terms of teaching.
And as tough a man as you'll ever meet.
Really tough?
Yeah.
Did you, in reading the Eisner Miller book, I had the impression that you guys often butted heads.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that right?
Yeah, I the best way I can describe it is that Will Eisner and I had an argument that lasted for many, many decades, and he won.
Yeah. Was he, not having ever met him, was he open to this argument? Was he?
Oh, he was a debater.
He was a debater?
Oh, he was a debater. He was. I keep on describing this feisty guy who liked to argue, which he was, but he was a consummate gentleman. The conversations with him were long and argumentative and thoroughly enjoyable.
Now you, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you actually went to his studio.
Mm-hmm.
Was this the one in Florida?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Why are you chuckling? With the?
Oh, because I had just gotten my loft my big nice loft that, I was going to Will Eisner's studio. I was going to go learn at the feet of the master, and I went into his studio, and it was kind of in the back of his house, and he had this little desk that he'd had forever, and he used some tools that dated back to the 1940s,
yeah.
It made me feel rather
So
pretentious.
you're saying modest by any definition.
Yeah.
Did he have? I always think that your environment or the environment that you create says so much about the person themselves. Did he have a lot of books? Did he have? What was the studio like? Did he read a lot?
He's a very well-read man. Yeah, his work shows that. He very well read. But his studio was like everything in his home. They were almost. His studio was a separate area, but his quest for knowledge was everywhere. He had a huge number of books. He did incidentally. One of the many things he and I argued about was that I would talk to him about the influence of cinema on comics and how evident it was in his work, and he would deny it vehemently, saying that comics were a literary form, that the relationship with cinema was tangential at best and coincidental.
I'm not sure what he means by literary form as opposed to, the connection to film. What do you think he meant by that, a literary form? That,
to be honest, he and I had heated arguments. I thought it was a false distinction. I think that in a lot of ways it had to do with him wanting to establish that comics were not part of anything that could be associated with popular culture. And my attitude was and always has been that comics are a rather joyful part of popular culture, that they can aspire to be and achieve fine art, but they also can enjoy their place in popular culture as well.
Well, I would guess, and again, help me out here, but I would guess that his motivation for that particular viewpoint was that he had an enormous amount of respect for the medium.
Yes. Yeah, and also
he took it seriously.
But at the same time, he'd seen it through its hardest times. I could never know what it would be like to be a comic book artist when during the McCarthy era, or when comic books were equated with pornography, or were being most of all accused of being the major cause of juvenile delinquency for a time. A book called Seduction of the Innocent by a crank pop
Frederick Wertham, right.
Frederick Wertham had terrorized the comic book industry and had caused actual comic book burnings across the country. And it had shut down the best publisher of comics there had ever been, EC Comics. So he had lived through these times of absolute terror that weren't even a memory for me. They all happened before I was born.
That's right, right. And those of us who didn't live through that time or aren't familiar with it, there were actually congressional hearings about the effects that EC Comics in particular had in creating juvenile delinquents, and that and bebop music, I guess.
Yeah, bebop music, yeah.
Because we all went right to hell after that.
It all was mixed in with this weird mishmash of fear of communism and a whole generation's terror of its own children is the best way I could sum it up. But EC Comics were these masterpieces of absurd grotesquerie, and with those beautifully illustrated gore stories.
Yeah.
And they got parents very up in arms.
Yeah, I so admired, and I would guess, I don't want to speak for you, but I would guess you did too.
Yeah.
In terms of their really pushing the envelope.
Oh, yeah.
At that time.
Oh, yeah.
Including the censorship envelope.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
The timidity of the 50s.
Oh, yeah. And also, as far as EC Comics goes, any publisher that published everybody from Fieldstein to Kurtzman to Wallace Wood to Johnny Craig, it's okay in my book.
Yeah, and a lot of those, and again, I think probably the audience knows a lot of that material, but some of those stories, a lot of those stories hold up today, and even beyond that, I think they are looked upon as masterpieces.
Oh, without question. For instance, Harvey Kurtzman's Two-Fisted Tales and his other war comics, those are authentic, meticulously researched war stories that I mean, you could use them in classrooms.
Well, it comes to mind that Kriegstein's Master Race is, of course, one of those stories that if anybody knows any EC story, that would be that one.
If anybody knows anything about the history of comics, they know Kriegstein's Master Race. That is one of the absolute triumphs of first of comic storytelling, but beyond that, it's just a smashing combination of comics and political drama and psychodrama, all in one. And it's 8 pages long? It's something like that.
Something like
very
that,
short.
yeah.
They're all 8 pages long.
And an amazing technique in terms of, and in reading about that, at least the stuff that I've read about, say, the Master Race, to take a detour, I think Kurtzman wrote that, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, Kurtzman wrote just about all of
Right.
it. Yeah.
So I'm assuming that.
Johnny Craig was the only exception. Johnny Craig
He
wrote his own crime suspense stories. But I believe Kurtzman was the other writer.
Yeah, he was the guy, basically.
He must have worked nonstop.
Yeah, I mean,
Because he not only wrote them, he laid them out.
Right, incredibly prolific. Yeah. But in thinking about the Kriegstein story by the Master Race story by Kriegstein, he recut Harvey Kurtzman's script because Harvey Kurtzman basically used a 6-panel grid.
Yeah.
And Kriegstein obviously used, a sort of like a film technique, many slender panels.
Yeah.
And it brings to mind just the notion that when we were working on Daredevil, that, and also when Claremont and Byrne were doing X-Men, nobody paid attention to those books. They were poor selling books, and when you came on to Daredevil, the point being that creators really need to have the freedom to create and make their own impression on their stories as opposed to the top down.
Well, my advice for many years was find a loser. Seriously, that people coming into comics now want to get their hands on Batman or Spider-Man or so on. And the problem there is that those are the hardest titles to get. And they're the hardest titles to prove yourself on because you're always going to be compared to the last guy who was really popular on it. Also the publishers are going to be saying, you're not good enough for this character. I mean, it's as simple as this. I got to do Daredevil because they were about to cancel it. Nobody else wanted to do it. The guy, Gene Colan, who'd been drawing it for about 150 years, ran screaming off it.
It's funny because it's true.
Yeah.
What did you? I know this might be. What did you take from Will? Or borrow? As we all borrow from the giants that came before us. Was there something in particular?
Oh, it's Klaus. It's like it is with every learning experience. I started out stealing the most obvious stuff in the world, lighting. Boy, he did spooky, cool lighting. And so I did my best to imitate that. Then I learned, you better learn how to draw if you're going to try to light that way. Because boy, do your drawings fall apart if you try to light. You just can't light something that isn't shaped right. But then it got down to the lighting being part of the composition, getting the composition right. Then the storytelling. Then the purpose of all this stuff, which is the story, and then the purpose of the story, which is character. And so I had to, even though Will had been telling me it in the right order, I had to learn it in the wrong order.
One of the things that I think the two of you have in common, among many things, but certainly I think the love of shape, and especially in your compositions, big shapes as opposed to detail. Big shapes as opposed to clutter. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely. That might be a matter of temperament. I don't know. It's all I know is that when I first got to work at Marvel Comics, I remember Jim Shooter showing me some pages by John Byrne and Terry Austin, saying, "This is the look. These are the guys to match." And I looked him over and I said, "I can't do it. I can't even think that way." Because it's one thing I know I'd never be as an artist is pretty. And their stuff was beautiful. And I just had to look in other directions and find a totally different approach. All I can say is thank goodness I hooked up with you.
Well,
because we were
thanks.
we were a natural combo that way.
That's really nice of you to say.
And we were kind of like we were the antithesis of what was the house style.
I think that's right. That's right. That is absolutely true. And I loved that period.
Oh yeah.
As I've told you many
it was a
times,
ball.
I think that was just.
We were working so fast, Klaus.
Yeah.
Jeez.
I don't know. Can I tell one story? One
I
Daredevil
think I know
story?
the story. Let's hear it.
There was a. Do you remember the drug issue? With
Here it
Punisher,
comes. Yeah.
Right? Do you know this?
Oh yeah.
So Frank did a story where a little kid was flying out the window because he was on PCP or angel dust or something, right?
Yeah.
So the comics code wouldn't allow us to do it, and Jim Shooter called us into the office. And for some reason, we were both in the office at that time.
We always hung out at the office back then. We all lived in town, and we all
That's right.
always hung out at the office. Yeah.
Unlike today, by the way, but the back then, the offices were a big hangout place. People used to sleep over, which you don't want to get into. But so Shooter called us into the office and said, "We're going to put in a reprint." Because the comics code wouldn't allow this particular story because of the drug references. And Frank, I remember you looking at me, and Frank said, "No, we're not." And I'm thinking, okay, what is going on? And we did an issue of Daredevil in I think 2.5 weeks from
It was about that.
start to finish.
It was about that.
Yeah, it was crazy.
This thing had to be written and drawn so fast that he and I were running pages over and back, and he was. I mean, it's the chicken scratches he had to work off from me were I don't even know what they looked like, but it was like we were working fast.
But I think, if I may say, I think the moral of the story, and help me out here, is don't listen to anybody that if they tell you can't do this.
Yeah.
Don't, right? I mean,
No, absolutely.
Just do it.
Absolutely.
It was great fun.
Well, great fun. That's an important note there, Klaus, is that this is great fun, and that's the reason to do it. Don't get in this for the money. You might end up getting money, but don't get in it for that, because then you won't have any fun at all.
Did Will ever give you business advice? Like how to handle yourself in terms of being a professional? Or?
Yeah, he gave me business advice, hand over fist. The most frequent business advice he gave me was stop whining. Because I would go in saying, creators rights this, creators rights that, creators rights this, and he'd say, look, if you sign the contract, it's over. Stop complaining about anything. His point of view was simply that if you're working on other people's material, then you don't have that much of a claim. And so clearly his whole point was that the future of comics was for people to be introducing new material.
Do you think that affected, your own career decisions in terms of, Sin City and 300 and creating and owning your own?
Oh, surely. Well, he was number 2 of people who affected me that way. Neil Adams being number 1, because Neil Adams was the one who had been pushing control of the ownership of the material for a long time. Will pushed it actually more on a creative level of it being his idea was, what's the point in just regurgitating the stuff that's been around forever? What are you contributing? And what does his point was that the more you're just repeating fantasies that were created before you were ever born, the further and further it's getting away from real life, and one of Will's central points was that all of this has to be anchored in real life somewhere, or there's no point in doing it.
Just as I'm thinking about different things, but just as a tangent, in reading the Eisner Miller book, he acknowledged that he turned down Superman. Do you remember this?
No, I forgot that.
Jerry Siegel, right? Jerry Siegel came to him and wanted.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Do you remember?
That he thought he didn't think it was a very good idea.
Yeah, that's right.
Look, 100 years of genius. Yes, right all the time. No.
Okay, he made one boo-boo. What do you think his legacy would be?
Let me answer it in 2 pieces. First one is how I imagine he would have answered that.
Please,
and
yeah.
then how I'll answer it. I think he would say that his legacy would be that. Because he pounded this point again and again, that comics are a literary form, that they belong shoulder and shoulder with prose. Absolutely right about that. And I would say that his legacy goes much further than that. In that, I think his legacy is that he thoroughly and absolutely established in America that comics or graphic novels or whatever are a story form in and of themselves. That intrinsically, while related to prose and to cinema in particular, but intrinsically are their own thing that owe nothing to anybody else.
To any other art form. That's an interesting thing to say.
But related thoroughly, just as cinema's related to prose and sculpture's related to painting.
Right.
But that what we do has its own place.
It strikes me as certainly interesting that he tried to, I guess, disconnect or put a little distance between film and comics.
Yeah.
Because his work seemed, to me, extremely fluid.
Yeah.
Do you agree? Do you agree with that?
Will was a complex man, and a very, very intelligent man, as intelligent man as I've ever known. And I think that it was his way of saying he wanted a little distance because he didn't want us to be in anybody's shadow. He wanted us to stand tall, and And that's particularly refreshing because for decades, all I'd ever heard was, it's just like movies on paper. And I was always surrounded by people who thought that comics were at best a stepping stone to a job in TV or a job in cinema or something. And Will's attitude was that these are all worthy forms, and you can enjoy whatever form you're in.
You know, you and I have spoken about some of this prior to tonight, obviously. Talk a little bit, if you can, about, you know, the difference between, say, film and comics. And what I'm thinking about particularly is, you know, the passivity of film and the active participation of a reader that's required in comics, the meaning of the gutter, you know, how the reader fills in stuff. We've spoken about this often. Do you remember?
I think they're, yeah. Of course, the media are different from one another in a number of ways, and it's, you know, this is not a matter of value in any way. It's just and here's where Will is really demonstrably right. Is that reading a comic book or a graphic novel or whatever is a very individual experience. It's a private experience. You know, unless you're watching a DVD in your home, going to the movies is a pretty communal experience. You're sitting in a theater and you're hearing other people laugh around you. So that is a very big difference. There's also the sheer scale of the industries is so different and the number of people involved in making them. I find that the making of one or the other is so different from one another that they're just absolutely wonderfully different experiences.
Well, that's really interesting to hear, because obviously you've had experience with both mediums, and you're absolutely convinced that they're very, very different from each other.
Yeah, the same values, the same central values apply. A good story is a good story is a good story. There's no escaping that. A good character is a good character. And story is, and you know, the hardest story is conflict. And by conflict, I don't mean two guys hitting each other. I mean, it can be a conflict within a single person making a decision. But I mean, there are great similarities, but the differences are they're just a subject of endless joy too.
You know, I love film, and I know you do too. But they are different, and my love for comics is not at all affected by my love of film.
No.
They're very separate.
No, it's a wonderful difference.
Yeah.
You know, it's a I cherish my involvement in either medium.
Was Will a film buff? Do you know if he?
Boy, if he was, he didn't let on.
He didn't.
I mean, he was so arch on the subject. He really didn't talk about movies. But of course, when we talked, it was pretty much on one subject. You know, unless it was about life. You know, in which case, it's not relevant to this, and it's not anybody's business. But when it was talking about the medium, we were staying on topic. He really didn't talk. I mean, I would start conversations about some of my favorite, movies from the 1940s and stuff, and he would be pretty dismissive and want to gloss over that.
And yet he struck me as being a talker. I mean,
talker.
Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, the book you mentioned that we did together, we did that in no time at all. And but yeah, he could talk till the cows came home. Well, he was a storyteller.
I think that's right.
Like the rest of us, he was just sitting by a campfire spinning yarns.
It comes down to that. It really does. I think the only difference between you, me, and people in the audience is how we do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the love of communicating and telling that story.
Yeah.
Frank, would you mind tell that story about how Neil Adams critiqued you?
It's a pretty brief story, Klaus.
Yeah, well, there's.
You mean when the nervous kid from Vermont came to New York City and went to see Big Neil Adams?
You sought him out, if I'm.
I was a real detective about finding Neil Adams. I looked him up in the Yellow Pages, and he was listed under Continuity Associates and Neil Adams. But he's also listed. Neil Adams was listed. I called up and his daughter answered. His daughter Chris answered, and I gave him my name and I said I wanted to be a comic book artist, and she said, "Oh, you want to meet Dad?" And said, you can see you around 2 o'clock. I said, "What day?" She said, "Well, today, can you make it?" Well, Neil had an open door policy. He took all comers. There was no filter there at all. And I came in with my chicken scratches and, the pages I'd been working on endlessly. And I hadn't gotten any professional work, and showed him all my proud opus, and he proceeded to tell me absolutely how completely dreadful it was, how completely without talent I was, how in fact I would never have any talent, and could not be taught. I was so bad.
I love this story.
And then he crooked an eyebrow, went to the refrigerator and got himself a Twinkie, and came back and sat down, and then he kind of looked it over and said, "Where'd you say you're from?" I said, "Vermont." He said, "Go back. Pump gas. Do something, because you ain't gonna make it in this town."
Yeah.
That was my first meeting with Neil Adams.
Well,
Then I was nearly in tears, and I said, "Mr. Adams, can I come back?" "Sure, I'll see you next week." Then I came back next week, a whole bunch of new pages, and he said, "Let me show you how terrible these are." He sat down with a piece of tracing paper and started fixing everything on them. Well, come on! I walked home with Moses tablets and got to work. He did this again and again, and then one day he said, "Well, this is terrible, but let me make a call." And he got me my first job.
Which was a Gold Key.
Gold Key Comics,
Yeah.
Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
I got to draw Rod Serling.
Yeah. But I think, one of the reasons why, if I may, love that story is it shows that don't take no for an answer.
Right.
That the key ingredient that we need as students that
Yes.
want to succeed in this business. Frank, you want to finish? Go.
Oh yeah, well and this again, I get back to something that Neil said, and this is very important. I'm glad you underscored that,
Please.
Klaus. Is that Neil? I was with Neil Adams and Jim Shooter at a party back when Jim Shooter ran Marvel Comics, and Jim Shooter was showing me off as the sort of the hot new artist on Daredevil, and Neil was giving his usual sour look at me, and he said, "Yeah, the guy showed up, he stunk, but he just kept coming back and kept coming back, so I had to give him a break, and yeah, he worked out okay." That's the best compliment I think I ever got from the guy.
But I think it shows that that persistence and ambition and
Yeah.
passion and commitment and all of those things that fall into the category
Without
of your
question.
personality are oftentimes much more important than your innate talent.
Yeah, neither of us will embarrass any of the people that this refers to, but we both in our careers have known people who showed up and they were the cat's pajamas. They were the hottest new guys in the industry.
Sure.
And they were in line for the best titles and so on, but it was like Icarus. They just rose too fast or something, and they didn't develop the discipline to meet deadlines. They didn't take any editorial instruction, and there's no point in reciting their names because you wouldn't recognize them.
Well, and the idea that you can have a career with longevity,
Yeah.
I think is, personified by Frank.
Well, and you, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, okay. But, this isn't a...
He's been around longer than I have.
I was waiting for that. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Absolutely.
And you have to kind of factor that into your decisions as students or as young artists.
And
Please.
keep in mind what Klaus just said. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And that reflects not only on your career, it reflects on the quality of your work. It's not something you do in a sunburst. It is best done by a practiced, disciplined hand that starts his workday at the same time every day, and doesn't impress all his friends by working all night until he keels off off the chair of his drawing board. Discipline is critical, and I find that routine is your best friend.
I agree with that. And speaking of longevity also, obviously Will Eisner had a very long career, and I would imagine that he was quite disciplined.
He was.
He was.
Yeah, I saw the way he worked, and the fact that he thumbnailed an entire book before he started executing the drawings added the professional step of submitting the thumbnails to the publisher, which
Talk a little bit about that, because that was relatively unusual, isn't
Well, in comic books, it's unheard of that he would actually submit his thumbnails, which means the rough drawings you do before you actually do the finished drawings. He would actually submit them for approval to the publisher. Now, Klaus and I belong to a much more arrogant generation. We wouldn't think of doing that. For one thing is, we really don't care what they think. So we just want to get our jobs done. And, we figure we know better than they do.
Yeah, but we've earned it. Come on,
Yeah,
we really have. Come on, it's really one of my favorite tricks is when an editor says well, I don't think this worked out. You should do something else. Change this and change that. I'll usually say yes, and then I won't do it, and they don't know the difference.
Yeah, there's that. There's that.
Is that right? No,
there's that. There was one time when it was an editor who I thought was particularly wrong-headed, where I simply said, I think I'll just change their names. In fact, I think I'll just change the name of the whole thing. Take it to one of these new publishers who's shown up.
Yeah.
It's like,
okay, but don't do that.
Don't do that. And I was bluffing anyway.
We're older. We can get away with a little bit. Good times.
Yeah.
I have to say. What was the impetus, Frank, for some of the decisions that you made in your own career? Which is, I hope you don't mind my saying this. You certainly, in a lot of ways, have been a role model for the rest of us. Not only
you poor bastards.
But not only from our generation, but also the generation that followed us, in terms of creator-owned and controlling your own work, and maybe getting it optioned, which is always like the the pot at the end of the rainbow for a lot of people. Was it what was your motivation, or because it certainly was a very noticeable incremental forward movement on your part, don't you think?
Yeah. Power is an unusual thing, and we are talking about power in this respect. That is, if you have power over your own work or power over your own career and all of that. But it's the main thing is to when you when you gain a bit of power, you have to figure out what you're going to use it for. And to me, if you gain power, the most important thing to use it for is freedom. To push things a bit further, to try something new that people aren't as ready for. So I think I've lost track of your question, Klaus.
Well, what was your motivation, or what do you think spurred you on in terms of, or drove you, in terms of getting more control over the work that you did?
Oh yeah, well, one thing is I just always thought my ideas were better, for one thing, because I'm arrogant. But the other thing is I've got a terrible fear of being bored, and it just drove me crazy when I first got regular work in Marvel Comics. That the big question was, oh, you're doing Daredevil. Which villain are you using this month? And so there's this roster of villains, and the question was, which villain did you get to use? And if you worked on Daredevil, man, the pickings were slim. You had the Stilt Man. I mean, Spider-Man had Dr. Octopus. And so...
Or the Gladiator. That was another
the Gladiator. Boy, we had a good time with the old Gladiator, didn't we? But and so at the time I did the logical thing, which was I raided Spider-Man's closet. I was out there swiping every Spider-Man villain there was, because but there was also this thing about I think it was Jim Shooter who insisted on everything being a one-part story. So he was overturning the legacy of Stan Lee, which had been things, those Stan Lee Jack Kirby comics went on were 5 or 6 issues, and that's how you got Galactus and all that fun stuff. But to me, I always wanted to do serials, and I kind of saw the Daredevil run once I was into it enough to figure out what I was doing with it. Once I was the writer of it, I kind of saw it all as one big shebang. That with it was like 4 pivotal characters. There was Daredevil and Elektra and Bullseye and the Kingpin.
Well, if I may say, I think the linchpin to the notion that it was one long story was Elektra, don't you think?
Yeah, because really her story from beginning to end is that's what I want in one volume. And when they did the reprints, that's what I pushed to have in one volume together. Because to me, that was you and I doing our primo stuff, and the stories were just flowing, and we were working so fast, and it was so spot on. Yeah, it was a really grand time.
No, it was fun, absolutely. And Ben Urich.
Was
the other character that I to this day I love Ben Urich. Yeah. I think he's an amazing character, and really you did rate him from Spider-Man. Yeah. But you made him your own in the same way that you did with Punisher.
I took him from an old Darren McGavin TV character, Kolchak the Night Stalker.
Sure.
And just plunked him because I wanted a reporter's voice in Daredevil. And luckily I had Joe Rosen, the best letterer you could ever get, lettering the stuff. So I just said, letter this like it's a typewriter, and he just magically did that.
By hand.
Yeah, imagine anybody doing that
great.
now.
Absolutely great.
Yeah.
Terrific. Yeah. And he lettered small.
That was the other thing. The guy lettered small, so there's all this room to draw. And the thing is, he lettered small, and I wrote tight.
That's right.
So there was it was all pictures on these comics. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I think we were talking. It was a couple of months ago. We were talking about one of your favorite lines of dialogue in DK2, which was, and I'm paraphrasing, but correct me, which was, "I'm the atom, I get small."
Well, yeah, it's done. Yeah, it's the third person. They got it pretty much right.
But
it's Ray Palmer, the atom, he gets small.
Okay.
I tried to sum up the character's powers as simple as possible. With the atom, it was easy. It was with the Flash, it was easy. He's already there. and it wasn't so easy with Green Lantern. Green Lantern, for one thing, he's got the dumbest name in comics. And second, he's got a ring, and whatever he wants to make happen happens. And he uses it to make like giant egg beaters and stuff. You know,
It's hilarious.
Actually it was when I was messing around with all the stuff with it was actually when I was doing the book with Jim Lee, the All-Star Batman and Robin, where I was trying to figure out what to do with Green Lantern in it. It was Brian Azzarello who clued me in. He said, look, he's Green Lantern. He's got a ring that can do anything. He's got to be stupid. That's the only way to write this guy.
Oh. That's fantastic.
So I wrote him dumb. And
That's
that way
great.
Batman was able to take care of him because
Well,
he just had Robin paint the entire place yellow.
I was just going to say, I remember that. Everything was just yellow, right? It was an easy coloring job, by the way. You're going to finish that, by the way, aren't you? The
Yeah, Jim and I are
All-Star
talking. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
going to get back to it and wrap it up.
Yeah.
I've been taking notes now.
Couple of issues?
So
What do you
that's,
think,
that's,
two or three, four?
after a short 20-year delay, we're going to wrap up Batman and Robin.
Hey, I think people will still love it, so it doesn't really matter. Can you give any advice to, say, a burgeoning young artist, writer? What would you?
Well, just you realize what a big job you're talking about, as simple as it is on the page, is you're talking about combining a whole bunch of problems into one problem. The best I can do offhand is to repeat what Will said to me, was that focus on story first, that story is everything, and of course character is story. So it's like but first know your story, and then everything springs from that. Everything, like the location, the characters come with the story, but the pacing of it, even the style in which you draw it. Don't think of style as something that, for one thing, don't think of style as something you own. You know, style is not like your favorite set of clothes. Style is something that you develop and apply to an individual job. Your personality is going to come out without you intending it. But don't think in terms of developing a way of drawing that says it's you. That people are going to see that anyway. Neil Adams once said, and I'm sad to say in some ways he's accurate, that style is largely a function of all the mistakes you make. That more than anything, your style is defined by the stuff you don't draw all that well. So now he had this sort of Apollonian idea that your style vanished as you became more and more perfect an artist. Although you don't believe that because your personality does decide a lot of it. But I do say that consciously worrying about saying I'm going to be the next so-and-so is a real bad way to proceed. You will pick up all the bad mistakes that your hero has, and your hero has bad flaws.
Let me check my notes, Frank. I tried to be prepared.
You're a Boy Scout, Klaus.
That reminds me, actually.
These are campfire tales, folks.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to start showing knots soon.
When you did the first Sin City, which was a long, hard goodbye, right? That was
The Hard Goodbye.
The Hard Goodbye.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm getting it mixed up with the Robert Mitchum
Yeah,
movie, right?
yeah.
Which, by the way, that and Family Values, I think I've told you, is my favorite. They're just amazing.
Thanks. Family Values was so much fun because that was such a complete psychotic thing to work on because I did it. It felt like I did it in one sitting because there are no chapter breaks at all. It was months of just grinding away on this one story.
Was that the Sin City volume that you allowed the story to dictate the length?
Absolutely.
That was the one.
It was not serialized.
Uh-huh.
And so I simply called up Bob Schreck at Dark Horse and said, I'm just going to do this Sin City without it coming out in different chapters, and I don't know how long it's going to be. So I'll let you know how it's going. And he'd call every few days and ask how it was going, and I'd say, well, it's going, you know. And then he'd say, when do I get to see pages? I said, when it's done.
That level of freedom must have been
It
absolutely
was
enervating.
wonderful. It was
Inspiring,
wonderful.
no, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
It had to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a good time. It was a good time.
That was a good piece of work.
Oh, thanks. Thanks.
Well, if you haven't seen Family Values, one of the things...
You know where it came from? Well,
Tell me.
the springboard for Family Values. This was back when most of you are too young to have heard of Pat Robertson, God bless you. But there were these creatures called televangelists who were out to take every sort of moral freedom we had away. And they were always preaching this nebulous phrase called family values, which they never said what it was. But it somehow involved being heterosexual, white, and middle class. And I got so sick of hearing the term that I just kind of, you know, I often come up with stories because I'm really pissed off at about something, so I decided I would permutate the term family values in every conceivable way I could, and if you read Family Values, you run into families of every kind, good and bad. They involve two hookers who are madly in love. And they involve a mafia don and his sons. So, like I said, good and bad, but it's everything I could imagine would be a permutation on family values, except a man and a woman who are married and having kids. And I thought I explored the idea of family pretty thoroughly.
You know, the subversive quality of it is just wonderful.
Thank you.
It's really
Thank you.
terrific. But in Family
An
Values,
important lesson from this: sometimes it's good to come up with a story because you're pissed off. Remember that.
I'll have to tap into that. But you know, in Family Values and in a lot of the other work that you've written, I think, and I'm asking him, help me out here. One of the things that I've noticed in your approach to the story is that you like to get to the point where things are spinning out of control for the lead character.
Right.
Or I'm thinking about, you know, Redemption with Daredevil.
Right,
with Rosa Kelly, where you stripped Matt Murdock of everything.
Yeah.
Is that something that appeals to you? I mean, I think one time you mentioned Dr. Strangelove as a favorite movie of yours. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Yeah. And that's a movie about things spinning out of control.
And particularly the idea of things internally spinning out of control, and for me is fascinating because these are stories about heroes, and with the Born Again story in Daredevil, for instance, it's one of the tricks of doing these comic books that have been sitting around for 50 years. Is you've got to every once in a while remind people who the character is, and they get all this continuity piled on, and everybody in comic books is so reverential of the continuity that they don't realize that maintaining perfect continuity for 60 years on a character who's not yet 30 doesn't make a lot of sense, and every once in a while you've got to shake it all down and get the junk out. And for Daredevil, for me, the idea was to just reduce him to nothing and see who it was that this guy was that's worth having having these adventures, and to show that it wasn't just the powers and all that. Because especially in the case of Daredevil, I mean, he can't fly. His really outstanding quality is an impairment. You know, he's a blind guy. And for all the great hearing and all of that, but he's a guy who's finding his way in the dark. And so, since I've always found him a wonderful character to relate to, I just decided to demolish him and then have him emerge from that as a truly unbeatable hero, because the evil Kingpin had taken away every single thing he ever had. His money, his career. He even blew up his house, and Daredevil came back from that.
Well, I'm thinking, I'm recalling.
Even look at what happened to Karen Page in that.
Yeah. Well, you did it in such a evil and malicious way.
Yeah.
Kingpin doing it
Yeah.
to Daredevil. It was, really, I have to say, delicious to watch, how it unfolded and how everything was stripped away from Matt Murdock.
Yeah.
It was a nice job.
Thanks.
Pretty good, I think. Yeah.
It was nasty.
Do you consider yourself a cartoonist, don't you, rather than an illustrator?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for several reasons. The word cartoonist means that you're combining words and pictures. But the other reason is that well, let me give you the pompous reason than the other one. But the pompous reason is that what I do with my cartooning is to deliberately abstract and reconfigure things to get as much emotion out of you or as much humor out of you or whatever is possible. I also don't consider myself an illustrator because I simply don't draw well enough to be an illustrator, and I can't paint. But I feel that my strength is story, and that I use my draftsmanship and everything in order to convey emotion and drama, more than to show you what a pretty picture I can put together.
Well, and I think, if I may, Ed, wouldn't you agree that Eisner also thought of himself as a cartoonist?
Yeah.
Yeah? You think so? Yeah.
Yeah, he was quintessentially a cartoonist.
Yeah. There's what surprised me was I remember when we were working on the first.
But let me also add the note here that this is no way. It says that this is I'm no way doing a my way or the highway thing here. There are very illustrative ways to approach comics that work astonishingly well. I'm just telling you the way I go about it. I look at some of the stuff that well, just to pick a name, Bill Sienkiewicz has done, combining illustrative technique in comics form.
Sure.
And it's wildly successful. Doing the Electra Assassin series with him was an education. And I mean, I was half expecting to find a kitchen sink planted on the page with the way he threw such wild things into the illustrations. So it's when I say all this stuff, it's not to be lecturing that I think that my way is the only way.
No, I absolutely agree with you, and it's fascinating to see two different approaches, which is yours and Bill's, melding in such a interesting and viable, a legitimate way.
Pretty crazy book.
Yeah.
Yeah, on Electra Assassin, I wrote him full scripts, just like I did with David Mazzucchelli. With David Mazzucchelli, I would write a full script. The artwork would come back. It would be perfect. The book would go to press. With Bill, I would write him a full script. The artwork would come back. I would write an entirely new script, using some of my words, but reconfiguring around the illustrations he sent.
Yeah, and they're both legitimate ways of working. I mean, there's nothing wrong with one compared to the other. Right?
Just one was a much wilder ride than the other. Yeah.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, Bill is a little, wild.
Yes.
To say. Yeah.
God,
but I remember during, thinking about the cartoonist label. I remember during DK1 when we were talking about how I should approach the pages, and you mentioned Mort Drucker.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
And recently you were talking about Chester Gould and how much you like Chester Gould.
Yeah.
And in looking,
And it was Mazzucchelli who had brought me back to Chester Gould. Yeah.
Can you tell that story? Or?
Well, it was when we were doing Batman Year One. In Batman, David and I had just done a long run on Daredevil. And we started Batman Year One, and it looked nothing like the run on Daredevil. The run on Daredevil was very traditional Marvel, and the Batman Year One was David Mazzucchelli at like nobody else, like nobody had looked like that before, And I was trying to, and knowing David to be a highly intelligent guy who was very educated in the art world, I was asking, I said, where is this coming from, David? I haven't seen anything like it. Because I was looking through old Secret Agent X9 by Alex Raymond and various, beautiful old crime comics from the 40s. And he said, Chester Gould, Dick Tracy. It's the last thing I would have thought. And I pulled out my Dick Tracy volumes and started studying them, looking back and forth. And what I realized was that he was inspired by Chester Gould, but David couldn't help himself. He was 500 times the draftsman that Chester Gould could ever have been. And so even when he was almost trying not to draw, the drawing was brilliant.
Yeah, did you remember, did you ever see his Rubber Blanket?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's wonderful.
That was just amazing.
Yeah.
Just absolutely
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
It's like watching somebody explode
Yeah.
with just ideas and creativity and,
Oh, yeah.
and all of that.
Yeah.
But I like the label of cartoonist personally.
Oh, yeah.
Do
yeah.
you?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's if you want to have fun with the drawing, but particularly if you're someone who wants to write and draw, it's a label that you're more comfortable with.
Well, and it allows you, I think, just to use, exaggeration and foreshortening
it's like I don't think you have any more desire to be an illustrator than I do.
Right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Guys, I think maybe we have time for, a Q&A, if that's
That was
okay.
the first hand right there.
Is that right?
Well, the first question, question about is the effect of is what filmmakers and what movies would have influenced Will Eisner. Well, keep in mind the era in which he came to maturity, and that you can zero in on it, and it's pretty clear. There's no question that Orson Welles affected him. There's no denying that. He even parodied Orson Welles with the character of Awesome Bells in The Spirit, but the influence is pervasive throughout it, and I think that if you look at films like North by Northwest by Alfred Hitchcock, that there's an influence there, but Will Eisner was very he was very knowledgeable of things all around the world. So I have no doubt that his influences go far beyond American and English filmmakers. What was the second part of the question?
If there were any writers that influenced Eisner.
That's more troublesome for me because he was so well read and his work was so personal but since I assume he was very well schooled, I would just point to the great storytellers of that I'm aware of in fiction. I mean, Ernest Hemingway leaps to mind. He had to have thorough knowledge of Hemingway, and the influence was on him.
Yeah, I'm thinking Faulkner too.
Faulkner, sure.
Some people like that.
Yeah.
From that, especially from that generation.
Yeah,
too,
absolutely.
Right? Yeah, because
Yeah.
of the time period.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Good question.
Yeah. Anybody? Is that Desi back there?
The way Will, well, first about his studio, I think I've described. It was very modest. The way he seemed, everything was story to Will. He didn't labor over composition the way I do. He would build outward from the character, and he would give everything the breathing room it wanted. But he would do little drawings of each image, and pick and choose among them which ones he wanted to use. But what was most impressive was the leisurely pace at which he let a story unfold. That magnificent opening of Contract with God, where the character simply walks in the rain for a long time. I shamelessly stole it in Sin City for Marv's Walk in the Rain, which had a much different purpose. But the subject being the rain in the man's thoughts was too good an idea not to steal.
I think environment has always been a big deal for both of you, right? Yeah.
And well, it's in his case he used it to dramatic effect, more to melodramatic effect in The Spirit, and more to dramatic effect in his more mature work. The Walk in the Rain, whereas in The Spirit it would more likely be lightning bolts and that sort of thing, and thunderclaps.
Well, the word that popped up often, I think, in the Eisner Miller book was operatic.
Yeah, I was the one who used it too.
But as a synonym for melodrama and melodramatic.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I think so. Yeah. And it was something I kept trying to provoke out of him in that book. Was because that was more the way my mind tends to operate, and particularly at that time. And was something that I saw in his work that he wasn't that eager to speak about, but his given the confines of an 8-page format, it's amazing how operatic The Spirit was.
Yeah, yeah. Well, his favorite, apparently, according to the Eisner Miller book, was Gerhard Schnabel.
Yeah.
Schnabel.
Yeah.
Which certainly had its operatic components and characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. If you haven't read that, you really should.
It's a heartbreaker.
Yeah, it really is. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. So his favorite was Gerhard Schnabel. My favorite was Sans Serif.
Yeah. The two-parter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody back there?
You never met Will Eisner. You didn't talk to him that way. He was a man, as he said it, he'd say, "Frank, I don't have all that much time left. I don't want to screw around." That's what he would have said if I'd had the nerve to say that, to ask him. But
I've heard that, by the way.
Yeah.
I've heard them. If I may say, there was, obviously nothing on the level that you suggest, but there was a Daredevil story that you and I did. If you remember, I think it was called Guts. And
Oh, yeah.
It was Foggy. It was basically
Yeah.
a story about Foggy. And Heather Glenn, I think
Yeah.
Heather was still alive at that point.
yeah.
But it was really a homage to
Yeah.
Eisner in so many, flying papers in the gutter.
Oh, it was
and all of that.
every Eisner trick in the book.
Yeah,
we were shameless.
Yeah. So that's probably as close as we got.
But there is a difference between that certainly was not a collaboration with him in any sense.
Sure.
And it's the generous word would be pastiche.
We're not above that.
Basically, we played with his toys. Yeah. I'm sorry. What
What did you think of the movie Batman Superman?
Well, I first started. What was the first question? Where did Ronin originate? Well, Ronin originated really simply because I got DC Comics really wanted me to work for them because of Daredevil, and Jeanette Kahn, who was running DC Comics at the time, essentially asked me what I wanted to do, and it said they'd publish it. And so I was young, wildly ambitious, and totally enthusiastic, and I decided to combine every single thing I liked in the universe in one book. And that meant combining Japanese comics that I'd come across, the Lone Wolf and Cub series, Kozurei Okami from and the Japanese comics, and the work of Jean Giraud in France, and I put together something that sort of resembled a story that pushed these two elements together in kind of a manic hodgepodge, and was working with Lynn Varley at the time, so it was also an experiment in attempting a European level of color quality. And the result was, like I said, a wildly ambitious book.
I think from my point of view, I always thought that Frank was a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of introducing manga into the American consciousness. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that you can, read his run on Daredevil and start to see some of that in there already, right?
Yeah, and I think the place where the manga really paid off in my comic book work, though, was not Ronin. It was in Sin City, where it was in black and white, and the pace was very much more like manga.
That's an interesting thing to say.
Where something would be given. There's one sequence in particular that comes to mind in Sin City where Marv is walking across the street and Goldie comes at him driving a little Porsche and bangs him around with that Porsche for like 3 or 4 pages. He's just being hit by his car again and again. And it drives away, and he just kind of, like being Marv, he just kind of gets up off the ground and thinks he recognizes her. But that was very much a manga pace, because in an American comic, particularly one of the time, that would have been one panel. And instead, I just kept it going because it felt right, and because I wanted that moment to breathe.
Do you think that one of the differences between American and Japanese comics is their how they handle time?
Yes, and I think it's getting worse because where American comics are getting more and more precious. We're getting so that we're printing them on better and better paper, and the price and the cost of printing is going up. That has nothing to do with publishers or anything else. It's getting more expensive to cut down trees, and the printing costs are going up. So the unit price of a comic book is getting higher and higher and higher, and consequently, there's pressure on for comic books to occupy more and more of readers' time. There's a couple of ways to occupy the reader's time more. The most obvious and worst way to occupy the reader's time more is to simply pile on the words. You can find those comics at the nearest comic shop. There are most of them. And the hardest way is to actually the second way would be to include more and more images to slow the reader down. That's also, to me, a cheaper solution. The best way to me is to make the images themselves make the eye want to linger. The best way I can put it is to charm the eye. I get back to perhaps my favorite cartoonists in strips, Bill Waterston on Calvin and Hobbes, in that you can't read Calvin and Hobbes without wanting to stick around because it's so damn gorgeous. And I don't read Calvin and Hobbes slowly. I mean, quickly. I linger. I want to see. I want to look at that kid, and I want to see his stuffed toy, and the fantastic adventures he's on. To me, that is the best way to slow the reader down, and especially with these increased production values, getting the reader to take their time is a huge challenge. After all, we're up against cinema, and they totally control time.
Right. Did you have a question here?
Yeah.
You take that first. I'm kind of out of touch with. I'm kind of thinking of a modern comic that's coming out right now. Nothing's really leaping to my mind.
I try to keep abreast of what's happening out there, and I'll try to get to the comic store at least every Wednesday or every 2 weeks. I liked a book that just came out called The Grass Kings by Boom. The first issue just came out, I think, a week or 2 ago. I liked Harrow County, which is a horror story.
Harrow County, I wish I'd thought of that. Yeah,
you like that?
It's very good.
Yeah, it's good. I wish I'd done it.
Yeah, it's a very good choice. Yeah.
I haven't seen anything, coming out of Marvel or DC. Well, the DC stuff, I really like the Hanna-Barbera stuff that they're doing, the twist that they're doing on the Flintstones.
Oh, yeah?
And the Jetsons, yeah.
I haven't followed any of it.
It's pretty sharp. It's kind of surprisingly good. But I think off the top of my head, that's probably what I'm. And of course, I like DK3. What do you have any?
I was just joining in with what you'd said.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you covered the bases. Nothing is leaping to my mind right now.
Yeah, it's tough actually. That is, by the way, my least favorite question.
Yeah, I hate that one. I
Is
hate
that right? Because you have to think about what did I read this week or what did I look at this week,
Yeah.
And it's hard, because you try to keep on top of it as much as you can.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anybody, guys, right here, sure. Okay, so the first part
Yep.
was what inspired you to make an older Batman?
Yeah.
I think getting older.
Well, to be precise, I was about to turn 30. Just, Klaus could testify. That is a frightening moment. But so I figured Batman had always been older than me. So let's knock it out of the park. Let's make him 50. I'll never turn 50.
And now we pray for 50. And, do you have a particularly favorite Japanese comic or manga?
Well, my all-time favorite is Kozuya Akami, Lone Wolf and Cub. I first discovered that back in the late 1980s, more than anything, that was the one that had the biggest influence on me. But I haven't really had opportunity to keep up on.
But you recommend it then to the audience?
Oh, by all means, it should be as much a part of your library as Eisner's Spirit. It's a critical understanding, and it also has a very strange virtue that American comics don't tend to share. It inspired a string of unbelievably faithful film adaptations, but Lone Wolf and Cub is an absolute masterpiece.
And a brilliant idea. I mean, just to begin.
Yeah, it's simply a father and his son.
Yeah.
The father is a forcibly retired samurai,
Yeah.
a shogun executioner.
Yeah. It's yeah. Yeah, I agree. Guys,
The other-
anybody? Hold on, Jacoby. Back there? Yes.
Well, not that one. No, I really wasn't all that surprised. He was I mean, his books were books of research. I mean, I wasn't wandering around his private library. His library in his studio was the books that related to the book, to the job he was doing. Eisner was a very organized man. So if he was researching a particular period in history, he would have a library set up of books on that subject. I wish I organized my projects as well as he did. Yeah, I like to define who a character is. There's something you're told to do whenever you're writing a novel or a screenplay, which is to write your backstory. And when I, in the case of doing Dark Knight, I applied that to when I wrote The Dark Knight Returns. I wrote up a full story of the origin of Batman, as if it hadn't already been done. Because really, the origin of Batman is one page long in a comic book published in 1938 or something. And so I wrote it out a bit longer, and just kept it in my file. And then when DC approached me about doing more Batman stuff, I pulled that file out and said, "What the heck? Let's see how this works as a comic book."
Back there, is that Jim?
Hey, Jim.
Yeah, Jim.
Precise as ever, Jim. He, without question, became quite literally more theatrical, and he would often refer to the comic book panel as being the proscenium arch to a stage, where he would view the players walking across it. So his angles became much more pedestrian, and that they became much more the same, much more eye level all the time. He wouldn't go for the dramatic cinematic angles all the time. And his panels became, he ceased using panels altogether, and it would flow the images more or less one into the next. but the experience was much more like sitting watching a play than watching a film. It was very much by conviction, by intent. Will had his passionate belief that comics should not be married to cinema, and I argued about it passionately every time we talked because I disagreed with him and disagree with him to this day. Yes. And he thought comic books should be married to theater and to prose literature, and that the relationship to cinema was a coincidence, because he thought that movies were based on comics, comics weren't based on movies, so we shouldn't be paying attention to movies.
I think, if I may say, that he wasn't the only one who thought that. I'm sure you know that, Jim. I think Gil Kane was a big believer in that, and of course Howard Chaykin is also a big believer in that. I'm sure there's more than that, but I just know of those two, personally, that it's more related that comics is closer to theater than it is to film. It's an interesting notion.
It's a notion.
Yeah. Anybody? Back here, right here.
I've been around that block a few times. They better happen at the same time. But what I would say is general practicing rule. What's more important? If you're doing a scene where the character's innermost thoughts are important, maybe you ought to write those thoughts down and then illustrate them. Illustrate what the character's doing while he's thinking them, or illustrate what represents those thoughts. If what the character's doing is important, more important than the words, draw what he's doing, and then if he happens to be hammering a board and hits his thumb, have him say damn. But otherwise you don't need words. Well, just follow what's more important. Story first, all the way.
Back here?
There are no challenges left. It's all just a slow, sad downhill slide from here. I mean, there's nothing but challenges. This job gets more fun and more rigorous the more time goes by, because the trick is you just get sharper about what shots you take. I mean, when Klaus can speak for himself, but when I started my career, I was a bull in a china shop. I was just charging in, and I was reckless. And now I'm more careful, but it's the opportunities are just boundless. And the mistakes to be made, they're countless. Oh, sure. The Bruce Timm one. Yeah. Loved it.
Yeah, I thought it was
terrific.
Yeah, thanks. I thought it was terrific.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I really liked it a lot. Yeah.
I liked it a lot better than Batman versus Superman. Yeah.
We got to that. Back here? Sure.
I never try to speak for a genius. But if Will Eisner were just coming into the field today, he'd say, look what a great job I did. If I were just coming in right now, I don't know.
Half joking and...
Actually, you know what I'd probably come in... No, let me answer that for sure.
Yeah.
Let me answer that for real. You know what I'd do? I'd come in and say, this is astonishing. You got this vigorous field, this wide variety of publishers, this eager audience that's open to all kinds of new things. I'm going to come up with exactly what I want to do, and I'm going to find a way to get it out to people. And see how they like it. I'd proceed without fear. I wouldn't worry about which character was popular or anything else. The first thing I'd do is I'd come up with my book and get a bunch of it done, and then see who'd be willing to publish it.
The answer that I would give you is if I were breaking in now, I would learn how to draw on the Cintiq. Yeah, because I don't have the patience for it now. Much to my regret, I think. Back there?
I got to say offhand, the biggest challenge was actually facing the man after I did it. But I don't know. I saw it more as an opportunity than anything else. The material lent itself to interpretation. The drama was there. The characters were there. The pictures weren't hard to come up with. I mean, I kind of had good source material. But so it was mainly a matter of organizing the story elements, then the joy of casting it, and seeing it through. It's real hard to think of any trial involved that wasn't a fun, creative struggle.
Anybody else? Back there, all the way back there?
The answer to all your questions is yes. The challenges in Sin City were just a blast. I mean, everything about it was fun. Everything about anything associated with Sin City is fun. Klaus and I are very lucky people. We've got really fun jobs, and I remember when it came to the Sin City movie, how Robert Rodriguez, when I first met him, he said I had worked a little bit in movies before and had not had the best time in the world. I hadn't been prepared for how it all worked, and it hadn't been my own material and so on. And I certainly hadn't been mature enough for the job. And I remember Rodriguez sitting down and saying, "You're gonna have the time of your life." That was the way he approached it to me. He didn't talk about what a great deal we'd do or what a great package it would be or anything. He just was talking about what fun it would be. And as in all things, Robert Rodriguez was a man of his word. It was the time of my life. Okay. I'm going to have to take the second question first because I can't remember the first because you went on. But what inspired me to do 300? Well, I could skip the pompous. I'll skip the pompous answer that would impress you and go straight to the one that's true. I was a little kid when I saw a movie called 300 Spartans starring Richard Egan. You saw it now, you'd be kind of amazed what a clunky old movie it is. But it told the story of the Battle of Thermopylae and the 300 Spartans. And I went completely berserk and was sitting next to my older brother, and I told him, and I sat there and got very bewildered at the end of the story because I said, Steve, they're dying. They're losing. And he said, yeah, it looks that way. We turned around at my dad, who was sitting in the seat behind us, and my brother Steve talked to him quietly, and he leaned back. We talked about it a little more, and I went back and I said, Dad, it looks like they're dying. And he said, I'm afraid so, son. And I kind of like walked home from that one going, wow, sometimes the good guys die. And it's just stuck with me, and I resolved that when I became a professional comic book artist, because I already decided I would be, and that when I got good enough, I'd tell that story. But it was that movie that formed my whole idea of what heroes were. That heroes were the guys who did the right thing, not the guys who won and got the crowd applauding them at the end. Yeah. Will Eisner was Daredevil wasn't the man without fear. I think Will Eisner was. He was willing to face all kinds of things. But he was a complex man. His mind was a wealth. But it would be a disservice to him in every sense to separate the man's religious and ethnic background from the artist. So much of his later work was about his family history and about Judaism. The pieces like the Super touched on the Holocaust. That these are all intertwined, and the older he got and the braver he got as an artist, the more he was willing to just completely open himself up. He, like I said, he was the man without fear.
Eric, how about two more? One more? Please, Amanda.
Oh yes, there was. Oh, well, to refer to him as a harsh critic, I wasn't kidding. He was. He did not tolerate faults. He didn't believe that. He believed that if you had faults, you left them somewhere else. You didn't put them on the page. But I was when I had professional questions to ask him, or even we didn't talk personally much. But when I had doubts about courses I wanted to take with my career, he could be extraordinarily encouraging and kind and generous.
Can I just say, just add to that? As a teacher, I often find it difficult to navigate between being encouraging and critical. So if you have a teacher who is critical, don't take that personally. They're actually trying to help you. And I'm not speaking to you personally, Amanda, but I'm to everyone. It's it's just a tricky path to navigate.
Yeah. Also, I've got to say that I think that Will was very much of the old school, and part of the old school, and I saw it all the way through to Neil Adams, who was that part of what they do is it isn't just a test of ability or judgment they're going after. It's a test of character. They want to see if you're tough enough to make it.
Yeah, that's right. Let me just say, I think Eric's going to wrap it up. But
Okay.
from me to you, Frank, and I think speaking for the audience, thanks a lot for doing
Sure.
this.
Thank you, sir.
I wouldn't be here now if I didn't think that I had an honest shot at one day drawing professional comics that I actually like, that don't feel factory made, that have pieces of myself actually invested in it. Frank Miller has proven that you can be yourself on a page, and it works. And Will Eisner, with all of his advocacy over the years, has invented the idea. After all, Will Eisner came to SVA with these ideas for a grand future of cartooning and left generations before me inspired by his teaching. And now, even a full generation later, people he touched as a teacher have shaped this industry and have shaped me as someone who has grown up loving comics. I stand here as a member of SVA's 2019 graduating class, acknowledging what Will Eisner has left behind so many years ago, and what Frank Miller has carried on in making comics that give my generation an opportunity to pursue our own stories, much like these legendary artists that have come before us and continue to make the world take us seriously. Will Eisner is proof that where there is a will, there is a way, and Frank Miller today, with all that he has done and continues to do, teaches us with his distinctive style of work that you can be a successful cartoonist without sacrificing your individuality to fit a mold. Today, we SVA cartoonists all have the opportunity to hear what it was like to know the man who changed our industry, spoken by a man who has lived through and done incredible things in this industry, Mr. Frank Miller.
Technical difficulties. Klaus Janssen's impact as an inker is undeniable. Known for his bold, thick brushstroke, lots of kinetic energy, and use of heavy blacks to create a dark Norrish mood, thus one of the few name inkers whose work alone can be a selling point. His work has graced such classic books as The Defenders, Punisher, Spider-Man, Superman, his classic 7-year run on Daredevil, and of course, Batman, Dark Knight books. He is also celebrated for his pencil work, most notably on Batman Gothic. Since the 1990s, he has taught sequential storytelling here at SVA and has written both the DC Comics Guide to Penciling Comics and DC Comics Guide to Inking Comics. Frank Miller first burst onto the comic scene with his groundbreaking run on Daredevil. His mix of crime novels, film noir, Catholic imagery, and stunning art gave the character a level of realism new to superheroes and was a turning point for comics as status quo. He had the audacity to make New York City, Hell's Kitchen, as much a subject of the book as the title character. He created the first female anti-hero, Elektra, and added martial arts elements to Daredevil's fighting skills. His ideas can be seen all over the hit Netflix Daredevil show. In 1985, he created the hugely influential Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. With this book, he merged great art and superhero storytelling with highly politicized and controversial elements. Good evening, and welcome to School of Visual Arts. My name is Eric Ingram. I'm an art librarian here at SVA with a focus on comics and sequential art, and I'm also tonight's organizer. Along with tonight's sponsors, the student organization Cartoon Allies and the SVA Library, it is my pleasure to welcome you to 100 Years of Genius, the life and legacy of Will Eisner. Thank you for coming, guys. Tonight we honor a pioneer in the field of comics and a much-loved, longtime SVA instructor, Mr. Will Eisner. I see some SVA alumni in the audience, some former students of Mr. Eisner's. I'm so happy to see that. Students, these are people that you should say hello to. They have knowledge to impart, and they have amazing stories to tell. I've heard some of those stories. Tonight's panel is a part of Will Eisner Week, which is a series of events that take place all over the world, celebrating Mr. Eisner's life and legacy. And this year we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth. Will Eisner is a native New Yorker. He was born in Brooklyn on March 6, 1917, the son of Jewish immigrants. He was a product of New York public school system, including the legendary DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. No, nothing for the Bronx? Okay. Where one of his classmates and friends was Bob Kane, the creator of Batman. At age 19, Mr. Eisner started working in comics. 1 year later, he co-founded the Eisner and Iger studio. There he created such early comic characters as Dollman, Black Hawk, and Lady Luck. At the studio, Eisner employed Lou Fine, Mort Meskin, Bob Kane. See, students, when I tell you make friends with your fellow students, they can get you jobs. He also employed Jack Kurtzberg. You might know him better as Jack Kirby. At age 22, displaying the tenacity that would mark the rest of his career, he sold his share in the profitable studio to work on his creation, the newspaper insert comic book, The Spirit. It was here, through his innovative storytelling, experimental layouts, bold art, and beautiful splash pages, that he helped create the tropes or architecture that would define the comics medium. He pioneered another comics form during World War II, creating educational comics for the U.S. Army. After The Spirit ended, he continued to produce these educational comics, successfully erasing any lingering campiness of the character. His dark, gritty seriousness and deconstruction of the superhero mythos, wholly original to this book, has become the universal language of comics today. His revision proved so strong that it became his version became the definitive version of Batman, and can be seen as recently in the movie Superman vs. Batman. He is also known for his original graphic novels. Ronin, that book stands out for its original mix of Japanese manga and French comics. He's also known for his creator-owned graphic novels, Hard Boiled, the Martha Washington trilogy, Sin City, and 300. That's all right, you can clap. These last two were turned into blockbuster movies. He co-directed Sin City and its sequel and produced 300. He was the first to successfully maneuver between comics writer, comics artist, screenwriter, film director, and producer. And today his career stands as a template for anyone wishing to work in the industry today. It is my pleasure and the entire SVA community's pleasure to welcome to the stage Mr. Klaus Janson and Mr. Frank Miller.
Eric, we're going to do a Q&A.
Yes, okay. Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
All right, buddy.
Yeah, what?
What do you want to talk about? Listen, I thought that we might start with, Frank, when did you first notice or become aware of Will Eisner?
Yeah, it was I was a kid in growing up in Vermont, and I would make it my routine to, when I was very, very young, I knew I wanted to write and draw comic books. And I was also a complete nut for reading them. And I would get on my bicycle and drive from the nearest, I'd drive to the nearest town, which was the capital of Vermont, and then over to its sister town.
This was Burlington, was it not?
No, it was the town was they both have French names, which I will mangle. The New England pronunciation was Montpelier and Barry.
Sure.
And I would bicycle to both towns in order to buy all the local comic books, because the distribution back then was nothing like it is today. The distribution was very, very spotty. So I had to bicycle to both towns to buy all the comic books. Well, along the way, there was one of the stores had this very strange comic book, which was much bigger than the rest, and in black and white of all things, called The Spirit. And I opened it up and fell madly in
with his company American Visuals. He did this till 1971. Most notably, in 1968, he created a pamphlet distributed to troops during the Vietnam War on the proper handling of the M16 rifle. The rifle was notorious for jamming. Years later, veterans would come up to him at comic conventions to shake his hand, thanking him, saying his pamphlet had saved their life. Mr. Eisner was one of the first to take comics seriously as an artistic and literary form. This thinking, combined with his exposure to underground comics, led him to recreate himself in comics in the mid-70s. It was during this time that he started teaching here at SVA. He created 3 classic instruction books based on his classes here. It was in these books that he coined the phrase sequential art. His personal and professional reinvention culminated in 1978 with the publication of his book, A Contract with God, one of the first literary graphic novels. The book is informed by his early experiences growing up in New York's tenements. These experiences would go on to become the inspiration for much of his later work. He went on to create over a dozen more original graphic novels. Appropriately, comics' most prestigious awards are named the Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards. Thought of as the Oscars of comics, they are given out every year at the San Diego Comic-Con. Mr. Eisner's work and vision for what is possible with the medium has and continues to inspire, challenge, and delight new generations. Happy 100th birthday, Mr. Eisner. Students and alumni, you know what I'm going to say. We have all of Eisner's entire life works in the library. We have every publication about Mr. Eisner in the library. Please come check it out. And for everyone else that's not a student or alumni, check out New York Public Library. I checked their catalog today. They also have all of the Eisner books. Please support your local library. One of the students that inspired tonight's event would like to say a few words. Here is sophomore cartooning and illustration student and Cartoon Allies officer, Amanda Erskine.
Thank you, Eric. As a student and aspiring storyteller who has benefited from the intellectual freedom Will Eisner and Frank Miller have given the comic book industry, I am thankful to them for daring to break out of the formula a successful comic used to have, to diverge from writing the Marvel way and giving my generation of artists proof that you can have your own thoughts, your own art styles, and your own voice and succeed at this career.
In love with it and wondered who this new guy was, because he was obviously the best guy around. And how he had exploded on the scene was, people usually take a while to prove they're good. This guy obviously was good instantly. I didn't know until I got home and read the comics and read the copyright notices that they were dated in the 1940s. It was Will Eisner's spirit.
And this was, I'm guessing, like the mid-'70s, right?
Yeah.
The first time that I saw Eisner's work, it was a very similar story in the sense that it was just shocking to me how different it was and how different it looked from what was happening in mainstream comics at the time. Did you have a similar reaction to it?
Yeah, it was to me it was startling on every level. First visually, the artwork was just beautiful and bold, and it didn't obey any of the conventions that had become so cemented in American comics. The other thing is it did everything in black and white without needing any color. I had no idea they'd originally be published in color. They never needed it. So I was struck by that. But beyond that was the sheer drama in it, and the adult content. By that I don't mean anything pornographic or anything seedy or anything like that. I meant the fact that it actually appealed to adult emotions. There were romances that were actually between men and women, that were not just juvenile fantasies. People actually wore clothing that hung from their shoulders and dresses that billowed in the wind. Everything wasn't made out of spandex. I remember in particular one story which was a two-part story that was 2 8-page increments, which was the story of the spirit and the first love of his life, Sans Serif. The very first thing I did when I became a professional writer doing Daredevil was to steal that story cold and use it as the origin of Elektra.
One of the things that, and check me on this, Frank, but one of the things that so impresses me about Will Eisner's work, and did even at that time, even though I didn't know that this was a thing that he was doing, was his ability to write and draw in a way that was very cohesive,
Yeah.
as opposed to the rest of the stuff that was coming out of Marvel or DC at that time. Do you agree with that? It seemed to be, and in a lot of ways, I think that you've carried that forward in terms of your own work, writing and drawing your own work.
Well, Will encouraged me a great deal when I told him I wanted to, when I was starting to write my own work. He said his own theory about it was that the writer and artist should work as closely together as possible. In fact, they should inhabit the same body. So he always saw the two as being one, one element, and that and he pointed out